12. May 1945, Kassel. In a notebook cut from brown parcel paper, a 34-year-old office clerk named Carl Hartmann wrote a line that, if spoken aloud, could have cost him his job or worse in the years to come. "We will build a new life on rubble and on silence, and the silence will be heavier than the bricks." The city around him no longer looked like a city. It looked like a broken equation. Streets reduced to axes and shards, walls stalled at chest height, staircases leading nowhere. Archival photographs from that week show the orangery sheared open and the Friedrichsplatz choked with mortared stone. The arithmetic of destruction lived in corners of every home: 4 chairs, 2 legs missing, 1 bed, 3 sleepers, 1 stove, no fuel. Carl took stock the way clerks do. He counted losses, ration cards, the number of relatives who did not come back. He added and subtracted in a world where numbers carried hunger and shame. The Americans had entered Kassel in April. The war ended on 8 May. For the people in the ruins, there was no ending as such. The fighting stopped, but the mathematics of survival began. U.S. Army occupation reports describe a population, poorly clothed, undernourished, humbled, and fearful. There were curfews, there were roadblocks, there were roadblocks. There were notices posted at the intersections with German words written in a hard American hand: surrender of weapons, report former party officials, return stolen property. People complied, out of fear, out of exhaustion, out of habit formed during 12 years of discipline. When Carl walked to the municipal building where he had once stamped permits, he passed a jeep on the corner and a stack of confiscated rifles tied with rope. He had not been a soldier in the last years. Asthma, then an office transfer. He had typed orders, lobbed inventory, arranged paper that moved between the Ministry of Transport and local rail yards. He could place his finger on any shipment of coal that came through Kassel in 1943. He could tell you when the station at Wilhelmshöhe stopped handling cattle and started sorting human laborers driven in from the east. He never wrote that last part down. Later he would say, "I did not know." But he understood that knowing appears on paper. The absence of paper, too. The Rubble had its own workforce. They called them Trümmerfrauen, the women of the ruins. Married, widowed, young, old. Scarves tied tight, gloves patched with bicycle tires. They moved brick with brick forks and fingers. They washed usable stone with cold water in tin tubs. They stacked by size and shape on sidewalks, as if the city might be rebuilt from piles like a child's toy. Carl watched them and understood the economy of their labor. For each hour, some extra bread. For each day, without missing, a chance at coal. The arithmetic of calories began to govern the hours. An Allied intelligence summary for Hesse that October put the average civilian ration at 1,100 calories per day. For heavy work, the body demanded 3,000. The deficit had to be found somewhere. It was found in potatoes pulled too early from gardens, in rabbits raised in courtyards, in the black market that coalesced like mold in the wet furrows of the city. Cigarettes became money. U.S. rations brought lucky strikes into the economy. A pound of butter for 20 cigarettes. A pair of shoes for 100. Sex for 2. The mathematics of hunger reduced all equivalencies to bodies, time, and taste. In one of his notebooks, Carl recorded a trade: 3 eggs, 122 bar soap. He underlined it twice. Soap is dignity, he wrote. He meant the smell of the body and the feel of hands against plates, the return to something called normal. There were missing people everywhere. Wooden boards stood in front of churches and at tram stops, nailed and overlapped with paper. Photos. Descriptions written by wives, mothers, brothers, birthmarks, scars. Last seen at Nemmersdorf, at Herkenwald, at the hospital in Stettin. The Red Cross ran a tracing service. Queries were filed on forms no different in design from ration cards. The bureaucracy of grief matched the bureaucracy of bread. In mid-1945, an Allied report counted 6 million missing, most from the fronts now swallowed by maps redrawn without their knowledge. Every day at noon, someone told Karl about a brother who might be in a camp in France, or a father rumored to have joined a column of stragglers near Salzburg, or a child put on a Kindertransport in 1943 who never wrote again. The mathematics of loss had no solutions. It was a ledger with numbers that refused to balance. Curfew rang at 9. The streets emptied. The Americans drove through with lights off as a matter of practice. Rumor moved. The fear of retribution had its own edges. An Allied intelligence summary from September noted whispered accounts of rape by foreign laborers, of people beaten for hiding Nazi uniforms in cellars, of looting by both Germans and soldiers. The distinction between justice and revenge sharpened in stories, dulled in facts. Karl wrote, "We stay indoors. We pretend not to hear the shouts. We learn to go on." He kept his sentences short when the weight of a longer line would break him. By autumn, the occupation changed from seizure to management. The Americans attempted order. There were offices in requisitioned villas, staffed with people trained to organize schools, fire brigades, police, and markets under new authority. German officials were asked to present themselves for screening. The denazification apparatus started as a clean cut and became a negotiated trimming. A questionnaire arrived at Karl's building in October. The Fragebogen. More than 100 questions. Are you now, or have you been a member of the NSDAP? Of the SA, SS, SD? Did you contribute to the Hitler Youth? Did you donate to party causes? He recognized it as a system of capture. The mathematics of guilt done with boxes and signatures. He ticked yes to party membership. A small Kreisleiter, no. Ortsgruppenleiter, no. Blockleiter, no. Or Blockleiter, no. He wrote since 1937 and added clerical work only in small, careful script. The Spruchkammer hearings began in 1946. People were assigned to categories: Hauptschuldige, Belastete, Minderbelastete, Mitläufer, Entlastete, major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, exonerated. The hearings used affidavits called Persilscheine, Persil certificates named after the detergent, a washing of record with testimony from neighbors willing to assert someone's clean character. The archives in the Bundesarchiv show case after case where a man's signature sits beneath a typed page that boils 12 years into a paragraph, joined NSDAP under pressure from employer, never attended meetings, assisted neighbor Mr. Aronson in 1938 when his shop was vandalized. Mr. Aronson was gone, no one asked where, or if they did, they recorded answers like emigrated. In January 1947, Karl sat in a hall with a cracked ceiling while a panel of 3 examined his file. An American officer sat to one side and watched. A German clerk took notes. The room smelled of damp wool. The hearing lasted 20 minutes. A woman who had worked beside him wrote that he had been a proper and honest man, not political. A former party man also wrote on his behalf, which helped and did not help. The Spruchkammer put him down as Mitläufer, follower. A fine of 50 Reichsmarks transformed soon enough to Deutsche Marks, removal from public office for a period. The mathematics of guilt resolved into categories that could be tabulated, then filed. The system needed teachers, engineers, policemen, administrators. It needed them quickly. The number of major offenders who went to prison was low. The number of followers who returned to offices was high. The arithmetic of order outweighed the algebra of justice. By 1946 and 1947, winter came with an iron insistence. The hunger winter. Coal was scarce because mining and transport were broken systems, not because the ground had less to give. Calorie rations fell to 1,000 per day in some cities. An American officer recorded in his notebook an image of two men sawing a dead horse in a street. A teacher in Marburg wrote in her diary, "Children asleep by 10 o'clock in the classroom. I let them sleep." A doctor in Kassel noted that lice were worse than the flu. People burned furniture first, then beams from the houses. In some places, even the books. Karl wrote, "My father's Goethe warmed our hands today." The words are smoke. He wrote it and closed his eyes. On the roads in those same months, another arithmetic played itself out. Millions of Germans moved west. Expelled from East Prussia, Silesia, the Sudetenland, the Red Army and new Polish and Czech authorities pushed them along, sometimes with whips and guns, sometimes with notices and deadlines. This was not the first time borders had shifted. It was the first time so many people were told they no longer belonged to the earth beneath their feet. By 1950, about 12 million had come into the shrunken German lands. The trains that had once brought forced labourers into the Reich now carried Germans out of what had been called the Reich. The records call them Vertriebene, expellés. They arrived with bundles and certificates, with family silver wrapped in cloth, with photographs tied in string, with stories of violence that fit too well into other people's stories of violence. In Kassel, in a municipal file Karl would later carry from a shelf to a desk, there was a list of rooms available to be commandeered for the new arrivals. The arithmetic of shelter: 2 rooms, 3 occupants, 1 sink in the hallway. Local families resisted. "We have nothing," they said. "We have less," said those who had come from Königsberg. Fights broke out in stairwells. A child's bed was claimed by a child who had slept in barns for 6 weeks. The city assigned a policeman to stand in the doorway until the agreement was signed. Karl found work face-to-face with these sums. In 1947, he was taken on by the Municipal Housing Office. He was a man with steadiness and a hand that did not shake when he wrote. He carried files from room to room, listened to complaints, measured square meters, assigned occupancy. His superior had left suddenly, and no one asked why. He entered names into ledgers so enormous that their spines creaked under their own history. He saw numbers attached to lives: 4 children, 2 parents, 1 wounded grandfather. The rooms did not expand to meet the demand. He wrote provisorium next to dozens of addresses. Temporary? The temporary would last years. The mathematics of rooms and bodies did not change with the weather, it changed with paper. The paper that required someone to move, the paper that allowed someone to stay. The displaced persons were near, as close as the next town. Jews from Poland and Hungary, Lithuanian survivors, Italians, Ukrainians who had been slave laborers in munitions factories, French POWs not yet repatriated. In the British zone to the north, at Bergen-Belsen, a DP camp housed tens of thousands. In the American zone around Munich, at Fehrenwald and Feldafing, the same. In Hesse, near Bad Arolsen, the Allied authorities set up a center to sort records of the missing and the dead. The International Tracing Service began there in 1948. Its files would swell until they weighed more than facts ought to. Allied intelligence summaries of civilian attitudes toward DPs often report 2 notes in counterpoint. The first, curiosity, indifference, occasional hostility. The second, growing awareness of atrocities, produces mixed reaction of disbelief, relief at personal survival, and refusal to enter into responsibility. Karl had known a man named Feibusch who ran a hardware store on his street. In November 1938, after the windows broke, the store did not reopen. A new tenant moved in before spring. In 1946, Karl saw numbers on an arm. He saw a man with that arm at the edge of the market looking at onions. He wrote, "The onion is a hard thing to peel. Each layer burns. We looked away then. We look away now." He did not know the man's name. He knew enough. He knew that trucks had rumbled past his office window in 1942. He knew that windows had become eyes that stealth could not close. He also knew that to speak in the office, to say, "We did this," was not done. The mathematics of complicity is the calculation of who you can talk to without losing your bread. Documents show that, by mid-1947, the Americans' Gus began to shift priorities. The Cold War pushed in. Communist parties grew strong in Italy and France. The Soviet zone just east of Kassel began to reorganize society in the name of a different justice. Allied policy moved from purging to building. Denazification manuals sharpened principal targets and loosened grips on the rest. The success of the Spruchkammern varied by district. In some, zeal. In others, indifference. In many, exhaustion. By 1948, the categories of guilt were still on paper, but their force lay mostly in the past. The mathematics of governance demanded function. A school with a student-teacher ratio of 50 and a damaged roof made no ideology on its own. It required a competent principal. If that principal had once been a party member, there were ways to right the Perselschein. The economy remained paralyzed. Price controls held. So did rationing. The black market absently obeyed its own laws. Inflation existed not in numbers, but in the length of queues and the distance between desire and possession. Then, in June 1948, the currency changed. On 20th June, people received 40 Deutsche Marks per person in 2 installments. Overnight, shops filled with goods that had been hidden behind counters for years. It was not magic, it was controlled release. But it felt like magic. The mathematics of scarcity recalculated itself in the currency reform. 1 DM to 10 Reichsmarks, and a confidence that was in part genuine and in part enforced. Karl woke that morning and stood in line at the instrument factory on the Fulda River where distribution took place. He counted his 4 notes and folded them in his wallet like a promise. He bought a pair of soles for his shoes and a bundle of leeks. He wrote, "The smell of a shop with goods is like a church that has candles again." The Berlin blockade began that month. History in pincer movements. On the radios and in the new newspapers, the airlift became a vast arithmetic of tonnage and weather. The arrival of planes with salt and coal in the western sectors stood for a choice that Germans were told they had, east or west. The factory where Karl lined up for currency that week grew busy in the months that followed. Machines came from England and America as part of the Marshall Plan. Crates stamped with black letters and numbers slid from trucks into warehouses rebuilt with foreign plans. In a comprehensive report from the American Economic Cooperation Administration, Kassel is listed among industrial centers receiving funds for reconstruction of transport links and repair of machine tools. Work returned. The mathematics of hours and wages replaced the mathematics of barter. Workers who had scavenged were asked to assemble. They formed works councils. The unions grew again. They elected representatives who quoted the basic law. These men and women believed in order and in a democracy shaped to fit a society that was older than any ideology. Karl left the housing office in 1949. The post had been a shelter and a trial. He took a job in a machine factory that made engines for farm equipment. The director had once been a manager in an armaments firm. He had been an offender, then was quietly judged lesser offender after new affidavits arrived from former colleagues. He returned with shorter titles and longer caution. Karl heard the workers speak of him, not kindly but with resignation. "He knows machines," they said. The arithmetic of knowledge outran the calculus of justice. Carl's desk held ledgers again. He balanced accounts. He discovered that numbers carry responsibility without guilt. He felt relief. He also felt the weight of it with each shift whistle. The political frame around his life hardened into a structure. In 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was declared in Bonn. The basic law was short enough for teachers to read more than once in a year. Konrad Adenauer assembled a government that promised stability. The Allied High Commission monitored everything and intervened when it chose. Germans made choices in the spaces left. They rebuilt cities with glass and concrete. They marked bomb craters with parks or memorials. In many towns, the first memorials erected honored the fallen soldiers of both wars and the bomb victims. Expellee organizations formed to tell stories of lost homelands in Silesia and the Sudetenland. They put up carved stones in plazas that declared, "We do not forget." They did not say what else would not be forgotten. In city council minutes from Kassel in 1951, a debate about a memorial to murdered Jews lasted 15 minutes. A debate about a memorial to bomb victims lasted 2 hours. The mathematics of remembrance reflected the mathematics of votes. Carl had a child in 1950. A boy. He grew in an apartment with 2 rooms and a kitchen, one of those provisoriums that hardened into permanence. In the evenings, Carl read the new school books. He did it because he understood that his son would be taught a version of the past that might either make him a citizen or an amnesiac. The school books showed governors and laws, rights and duties. They said that National Socialism had been wrong because it was a dictatorship. They said the present was right because it was a democracy. They sometimes said that Germans had suffered from bombings, from hunger. A short chapter on the persecution of Jews listed facts and numbers without faces. It told students that such things must never happen again. It did not say how to live with what had been done already. An occupation report on education noted the attempt to balance between imparting responsibility and avoiding paralyzing shame is uneven. The files of the denazification courts were moved to archives. The Sprüchkammer rooms became classrooms. The names of categories gathered dust. A law passed in 1951, the so-called Article 31, allowed former civil servants dismissed in the post-war years to be rehired or receive pensions. Men who had been advisors on racial matters returned as advisors on health matters. Women who had organized party women's groups ran youth sports. The mathematics of bureaucracy is recursive. It demanded experience and delivered it from wherever it lay. The price was silence. Not an enforced silence at every table, but a soft silence inside the words, "Let us look forward." In 1953, as the economy accelerated, the incidence of people telling the truth about their past in the workplace declined. An internal memo at the machine factory said carefully that political discussion during working hours reduces productivity. Carl wrote less in his notebooks. The entries he made were methodical, a man used to writing only what needed to be written. 9. March 1952. New production series, shortages of copper improving. 18 September 1954. Son started gymnasium. Science teacher speaks well. Then, once, Frau L. from number 12 saw her husband's name in the newspapers. A list from Arelson. He died in Neuengamme, 1944. He went to the desk in the evening with the lamp lit low and wrote, "We believed words wash away. They remain in the paper. They stick to us like soot." Contact with those who had survived continued without becoming central. DP camps closed slowly. Some survivors stayed. They continued to live in country that had built machinery to erase them. A few Andreases and Ruths moved into apartments on Carl Street. The baker served them. The barber cut their hair. The numbers on their arms faded like ink on old documents but did not disappear. Their presence created a pressure that could not be articulated in municipal minutes. An Allied intelligence report in 1949 observed Germans increasingly expressed desire to be normal and to avoid the politics of the past. Jewish presence seen mostly through charities and schools. Sympathy is expressed, but it often coexists with a wish to move on. With the economy came deodorized words to cover the stench. The phrase economic miracle appeared in newspapers in 1952. Miracle presupposes a god. The gods in this story were American money, German labor, and a political class that had been formed by the necessity to constrain choices. A factory that had made parts for tanks now made parts for tractors. Houses rose 7 stories. Glass windows reflected clean lines. Cities modernized themselves into images that shook off the sculptural weight of the past. The mathematics of output crowded out the mathematics of atonement. In the factory, the older men kept their heads down. The younger men learned new skills. They joined works councils that believed social partnership could keep peace. Carl recorded wages and overtime. He watched women leave the Rubble crews and rejoin family life. He watched his son bring home homework that asked him to memorize articles of the Basic Law. In 1955, the Federal Republic gained sovereignty. West German prisoners in the Soviet Union trickled home. A parade was held for a group of men, thinner than the uniforms issued to them. They marched past a memorial for bomb victims. People cried. Some cried for the men. Some cried because it was a way to cry for everything else. A Bundesarchiv file contains photos of men in Kassel holding bouquets. A caption says, "Homecoming." It does not say where they had been, what they had seen, what they had done. The arithmetic of return counts heads, not shades. There was a specific day when Karl walked to Bad Erelson. It was June 1956. He took a day from work and rode the bus, then walked the last kilometer. The International Tracing Service had an open day for local officials to see the scope of what they stored. He entered a building where shelves ran like fields and the air held the smell of glue and older loss. A guide told them that the ITS held records for 15 million people. He said 15 as if it were a precise thing, which it was, and not a metaphor. Karl looked at index cards. He saw a man's name with a line drawn through it. He saw documents stamped with a number and a date and a reason. He saw letters from mothers. He saw accusations. He understood in his hands the mathematics of disappearance. He asked no questions out loud. He wrote a line in his notebook when he got home. They made suffering into a file so it could be returned to the living. Public commemoration unfolded along predictable lines. In November of each year, people gathered in front of memorial stones whose inscriptions were carefully worded. Mourning, not analysis. On 9 November there was often rain, the anniversary of the broken glass. In the 1950s, mayors sometimes said nothing. Sometimes a schoolteacher spoke. She used phrases like, "We remember all victims of all wars." The language hid more than it revealed. Karl stood in the crowd. He did not speak. He kept his eyes on the wreaths. There were people who did not accept silence. Pastors organized study groups. Journalists peeled at layers. A young generation grew into adolescence. They asked questions their parents could not answer with the old formulas. For Karl, the pressure took shape in a series of files. In 1957, a man he worked with was called to testify in a case against a former Gestapo officer. The man did not want to go. He had a family. The old fear had learned a new name, inconvenience. The case lasted weeks. The testimony described a basement room lined with tiles and a drain. The words did what they always do when confronted with the unfaceable. They slid around it. Karl read the newspaper summaries. He held the paper up and felt its weight diminish as his hands trembled. The Cold War's mathematics assigned Germans to a ledger in which loyalty and production had more immediate value than confession. The Allies lifted controls. The German courts handled German crimes. There were trials. Some ended in prison terms. Many ended in suspended sentences. The arithmetic of laws applied in a system that demanded evidence and followed rules that had been designed to protect citizens. Those rules had been dismantled during the dictatorship, then restored. They now made prosecution harder. This was a just thing, and it produced unjust results. An Allied legal advisor wrote in a summary, "The desire to observe due process coexists with social incentives that discourage thorough reckoning." The phrase "cold justice" appears in one file. It is not a compliment. In 1961, Karl's son turned 11. At school, the teacher spoke about the Berlin Wall. The East closed its people in. The conversation at dinner was about freedom. It was not about the man from whom their dining table had been bought in 1942 when the hardware store closed. The mathematics of memory still divided the days. Karl worked through the seasons. He grew older. He watched his son raise his hand in class and ask why his grandfather had a photo in uniform from 1939. The teacher said, "We will talk about that in the higher classes." They never did. Then the trials began again. In Frankfurt, beginning in 1963, proceedings numbered in the dozens, the Auschwitz trials. Men and women came forward with numbers on their arms that had faded to ghost. Judges listened to testimony that described mathematics of another kind, quotas for murder, counts of trains, timetables. The German public witnessed scenes that had the feel of a country interrogating itself in its own language. On the radio, the voices of survivors sounded old and urgent. Karl listened to one broadcast in the factory canteen. The men were quiet. Someone muttered, "We didn't know." Another said, "We knew something." Karl ate his lunch and tasted nothing. He wrote afterward in his notebook, "The air is heavy with words that are not spoken." The factory acquired new machines. Its management included men who had fought for the new democracy with a bureaucrat's tools. Works councils negotiated Saturday shifts. Karl balanced numbers into smaller decimals as orders increased and errors had to be tracked. The mathematics of the present demanded focus. When he went home at night and passed the street where Feibusch's store had once stood, he could still place the door jamb in his mind. The new shop sold radios and washing machines. The owner had a swell in his voice, like a radio announcer. On Sundays, the family took the train to the Edessee and ate sausage from paper and watched the water where planes had once flown low. The expulsions remained a visible scar. In 1960, a Heimatvertriebene Society in Kassel organized an exhibition. Photos of snow-filled roads, carts half buried, children wrapped like packages. In the visitor's book, entries read, "We know what it is to suffer." The exhibition text used the word innocent more than once. The mathematics of pain often demands that it be made pure. The Bundesarchiv contains a letter from a Jewish survivor who visited and wrote that he felt a strain in the room. He used the word still, silence, in a tone that is not respectful. He suggested another exhibition, photos of those who had been forced onto trains going west when the winds were colder. No such exhibition was held that year. By the mid-1960s, new teachers arrived at schools. They had read different books. They assigned students to read Anne Frank's diary. They showed them the photo of a little boy with his hands up in Warsaw. They said, "This happened." They less often said, "This is what your father did while it happened." For some families, this was enough to open a crack. For others, it sealed the silence with a new layer of defensive talk. "It was the times," said a woman in a taped oral history in 1965. "We all did what we had to in the times." The mathematics of accountability contends with the arithmetic of life lived under pressure. Neither balances to zero. Carl retired in 1974. He had spent almost 3 decades inside a reordered country. He moved files into cabinets and counted wages in a currency that had not existed when he made his first notebook entry. He lived through an era in which American chocolate bars had power, then law, then memory. He watched the town lay new pipes and build new schools. He watched the men who had been boys in 1945 rise into positions of authority in West Germany. He sent his son to university. He did not tell him that in 1942 he had watched a convoy of people pass his window. He did not tell him that he had known enough to be afraid. In retirement, Carl had time to spend with his notebooks. He read the lines he had scratched with a chewed pencil in May 1945. He read the entries about denazification, written with a hand steady enough to record his own hearing without shaking. He read the lines in 1948 about new currency. He read the notations about expellees assigned to the 4th floor at Wilhelmstrasse 11. He remembered the woman with 2 bags who had asked, "Where shall I put his photograph?" He had answered at the time, "On the shelf, over the bed." He had hinted at the mathematics of space in a way that allowed her to keep a space for someone who had no body. He reached out to the International Tracing Service once. In 1976, he wrote to ask about Freibusch. He had only the name and a street. He received a reply. The reply said, "No trace found under the name provided. Possibly altered spelling. Please supply more information." He had none. He put the letter in his drawer. He closed the drawer with a careful pressure so that it clicked at the same point it always clicked. Many of the men who had sat in rooms with him in the first post-war years were dead. The Trümmerfrauen were old women. They had their own memorials now. Politicians praised them. The praise was a way to talk about the war without saying what had been done. Carl attended a ceremony in 1985 where the mayor called them the mothers of our city. He watched the women sit in their coats, their hands striated with the years. He thought of the piles of brick he had seen washed with cold water. He thought of the mathematics of their labor, 30 kilos lifted, 600 times for bread. He clapped. He also felt the weight in his chest of a debt that had no ledger. Archival voices continue to speak when the living go silent. Occupation reports catalogued moods. Denazification files quantified guilt. Allied intelligence summaries recorded the pulse of a society that wanted to live and not think. Bundesarchiv records indexed names until the paper bent under them. Oral histories carried voices that could not be heard at the time they spoke. In those voices, another arithmetic emerges. Not the arithmetic of calories and rooms, not the mathematics of guilt reduced to categories, but something like calculus, the change in one life over time when measured against the rate of forgetting. The suppressions and compromises had their logic. A country requires continuity. Children require fathers. The economy requires managers. The rule of law requires that the state be reconstituted with people who know how to operate it. The mathematics of stability is not the enemy of the mathematics of justice. It is its condition. But the time window in which both can be satisfied often closes faster than any society can legislate or love. The Cold War closed that window in Western zones, and other winds closed it in the East. The greatest change in Carl's life lay not in politics or economics, but in the speed with which the present overtook the past. That speed allowed him to eat and to sleep. It also allowed him to write less and less of what he knew. In the late 1980s, 2 things shifted at once. The East opened. The Berlin Wall fell. The shelves at Arlson were reordered. A new generation of historians and grandchildren asked for files. They asked for names. They used names without fear. They published. The mathematics of accountability changed its unit from suspicion to curiosity. Carl was old. He was moved by these shifts as a man in a chair is moved by a draft under a door. He watched the television with the sound slightly too loud. He watched his grandchildren go on a school trip to a former camp. He looked at their faces in photographs. He did not know what to say. He wrote, finally, "They will be good people. If we are careful, they will be good people." He examined his notebooks and decided to write what he could say without boasting and without absolution. He began as he had begun in 1945, with short lines. 31 January 1990. The city has new light. It is different. We have remained the same. 12. At the market I saw a woman with a tattoo. She bought pears. She had a gentle voice. 7 November 1993. My son asked me again, "What did you do?" I said, "I lived." He stopped for a long time after that. On the last page, he copied the line he had written at the beginning. He added a sentence. He noted the date. 8 May 1995, Castle. VE Day, 50 years. He sat in a room with a view of a rebuilt street. He opened a notebook with a broken spine repaired with tape, its brown parcel paper cover worn smooth by his hands. He wrote, almost the same line as before, but drawn not from fear, but from a fragile boldness. "We will build a new life on rubble and on silence, and the silence will be heavier than the bricks," he wrote. And below it, "I have carried that weight. It taught me the arithmetic of food and rooms and lies, the mathematics of guilt and of mercy." The front line after 1945 ran through my memory and my paperwork, not across a battlefield.